What's up, Truth? This is Ben here, and today we're going to talk about the papacy. Now, I think the papacy is very important to talk about. I've been talking about sola scriptura and the scriptures a lot, but I think I'm going to move on to the papacy. Well, because I'm encountering a lot of resistance, and I think the main point of contention is with a matter of authority. Where does the authority lie? Does it lie with the church, or does it lie with the scriptures? And I know that a lot of Catholics, they lean more towards what I would consider sola ecclesia, right? Solely in the church. The church is infallible, it's authoritative, they have the right to determine what Scripture says and how to interpret Scripture. So even if you see things in the Scripture and you don't know if it's right or wrong, you don't know how to interpret it, the church says, it's okay, we're the church, so we're going to be the ones to interpret it because we have the authority to interpret it, because the Scriptures have given us the authority through the papacy. Now I think this is going to be important to talk about. So I'm going to get into my notes here, and we're going to talk about Matthew 16, very important, Matthew 18. We're going to look at a couple of different things here. We're going to look at the Greek and why I think the Bible doesn't support the papacy at all, but we're going to get into it. So first, let me kind of run down why we're doing this. The entirety of the papacy and the authority of Rome is almost single-handedly held up by these few verses, and that's Matthew 16. The establishment of Peter as the first pope, passing of the title the Rock to him, and every single papal dogma that has come since then is held up foundationally by this small section of Scripture, and I believe that's true. If this verse and other verses don't support the establishment of the Roman Catholic Church and its structure, its hierarchy, its authority through Peter, then everything else is irrelevant, because the church in and of itself doesn't have the authority to make any pronouncements that affect every single Christian. Let's take a look at a couple of these verses and we'll see if they hold up. So we're going to start with Matthew 16, and now that's my premise there, is that I think if Matthew 16 falls, and the authority of the church, the Pope, the idea that he is now the rock, and he is the one who's leading the church instead of Jesus Christ, then I think the rest of it falls down. So let's get into it. Let's look at Matthew 16. We're going to start in verse 13. Very familiar verse to Roman Catholics and non-Roman Catholics alike. Verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Obviously asking, who is the Son of Man? Asking about himself. Who do people think I am? Am I this? Am I that? What do they say? And they say to him, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets, Old Testament prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Not who do they say that I am? You, my apostles, my 12, my elite, if you will, my followers. Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The Christ, obviously, Greek rendering of the Messiah, so he is the Messiah of the Old Testament. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Now we're going to look at the Greek here too, but it's important because Jesus says, hey, blessed are you, Simon, but this is not something that you figured out on your own. You didn't discover this. You didn't make this up. This isn't some kind of amazing conclusion that you came to. No, he says, flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So all the glory for the recognition of this statement doesn't go to Peter, it goes to the Father who is in heaven. It goes to God himself, because he is the one who has revealed this. Now we'll look at the Greek. It's not super important if you can't read the Greek, but I'll go through some of it here. Pakrathes de ha Jesus epen autou, Makarios a. So Makarios, blessed, a, verb form of a, meaning him. So blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, hate sarx kai haima, so rather blood and flesh. Uk is a negation. Pakalupsin, soy, did not reveal this to you. Al, which is Allah, you see the mark there. Ha pater mu, my Father. Ha en tois or ranois, who is in the heavens. Verse 18, it's very important. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Very important, because what Roman Catholics will often say is, well, see, yep, obviously, he says, you're Peter, and on this rock, you, Peter, you're the rock, you're the one I'm giving my keys to, you're the one I'm building my church on. But I don't think that's what he's saying. There's a couple of different ideas going on here, but let's read it in the Greek, because this will help, because what's actually happening is Jesus is doing a play on words, because Peter and rock sound very similar in Greek, not in English, but in Greek. So, kago de soy, legoi hate su, a petros, and I say to you, or lego, I am saying, hate su a petros, that you are Peter. Kai epi taute te petra, and epi upon taute, this te petra, this rock. So Petros and Petra in the Greek sound very similar. So it's a play on words. So he's calling him Peter, Petros, and upon this Petros. So he doesn't say upon, he doesn't say, you are Petros, and upon this Petros I will build my church. It's you are Petros, Peter, and upon this Petra, rock, I will build my church. Koi do meso mutain ecclesion, and upon this rock I'll build my church. Kai tu le I'll do a negation. Katis kususin autes, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So what's happening is that he's not saying that Peter is the rock, because we know that Peter isn't the rock, because the rock, if you look at the Old Testament, if you look at Psalms, the rock is Christ. It's always been Christ leading up to it. Peter isn't the one that is prophesied. He's not the one that is the rock in the Old Testament. He's not the one who's the rock in the Old Testament. We see in 1 Corinthians that the rock is referring to Jesus. So it's a play on words. So that's one of the issues here. But then, obviously in verse 19 they'll say, well, see, but this he's given the keys and the power to bind and things. He's given that to Peter. Verse 19, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. So we're gonna get back to that here in a second. But let's just look down the very next verse, right after Peter, supposedly the Pope is established as the rock, which I don't think he is, and I think a reading of the Greek will show you that. We see this happen. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. So Peter, the first pope supposedly, is trying to correct Jesus, who is God, the rock. And Jesus says, but he turned to him and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, or adversary. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your minds on the things of God, but on the things of men. So directly after this verse, we see Peter arguing with Christ, telling him that he's wrong and that his plans aren't going to happen. And then Jesus calls him Satan, adversary. So it is weird that the first pope, the one who's supposed to be leading the church, is being directly yelled at, corrected. Jesus doesn't have very nice things to say to him right here. Calls him Satan, adversary. He says he's not setting your minds on the things of God, but on the things of man. So I just think it's interesting that Matthew includes this right after, because if you're going to claim that Peter's the rock, and you look at the Greek, and I don't think you can show that from the Greek, it's interesting that right after that we see the first pope being chastised by Jesus immediately. But let's take a look at a parallel, right, in another gospel. So in the book of Mark, which is very important because Mark, or the Gospel of Mark, is Mark, sorry for the shaking cam there, Mark is recording his gospel and his stories, and what he gets, he's getting all this from Peter himself. Because Mark, not one of the original 12, but his gospel is pretty much just Peter's gospel. In a way, you could say it's Peter's gospel because that's where his information comes from. So what you find in Mark is what you find Peter preaching, teaching, and telling Mark. So in Mark, and we'll start in verse 27, we're talking about the same story. Verse 27, and Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, Who do the people say that I am? So same story being recorded by Mark as told by Peter. Verse 28, and they told him, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, But who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, You are the Christ. Petros lege auto, su e ha Christos. Peter saying to him, You are the Christ. And then verse 30, and he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. So Peter, who is the first pope who is being established as the rock according to Roman Catholics, doesn't feel the need to include the fact that he is the rock in his gospel. Now it's Mark's gospel, but it is Peter's account. And Peter and Mark, who I'm sure Peter would have been aware of this gospel being written, didn't feel that this landmark, explosive, super important establishing passage that establishes him as the rock, the pope, the one to lead the church, he didn't feel the need to include it. But what does get included in verse 31 directly after? And he began to teach him that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be killed by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter. So turning, seeing them in front of them, rebukes Peter in front of them and says, "Get behind me, Satan. For you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." So Peter and Mark didn't feel that the establishment of the papacy was important enough to include in his own gospel. But they did include the fact that Peter was called Satan in front of the disciples. Now, it seems very peculiar that this wouldn't be included as if it's so important and it has so much authority and it's establishing a brand new office that every Christian in the world is supposed to get underneath and be subservient to. It's vaguely absent here. I find that weird. So it does make it into Mark. But let's look at some more claims. So let's go back to Matthew 16, obviously, because that's the verse that's, is supposedly the landmark one. So one of the things that we see in Matthew 16 is this claim, right? Roman Catholics say he's been given the keys, he has the power to bind and to loose and to do all this stuff. Well, just 2 chapters later in Matthew 18, we see the exact same power that has been given to Peter being given to every single believer in the church. So Matthew 18, verse 15, this is talking about church discipline. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. The exact same phrasing from Matthew 16:19. So this isn't a special, unique power or authoritative decree that Peter's been given. This is given to every single believer. And so it doesn't really hold up because it's not just something Peter has, it's something that we all have. So it's not something that Peter gets alone. And I think Matthew 16, if you read it in the Greek, you see that Petros, Petra, there's a difference there as a play on words. And so Peter isn't actually established as the first pope. And it is interesting that this is pretty much the only passage I see people, Catholics, pointing to as establishing Peter as the first pope. He seems vaguely absent, and his office seems vaguely absent from the rest of Scripture. But let's look at some other things. Another thing to point out is that Peter wasn't chosen as the apostle to the Gentiles. He was chosen as the apostle to the Jews. Not to the Gentile church, not to the Catholic Universal Church, but to the Jewish church, to the Jewish believers. And we see it 7 different times here. Biblical evidence show that Peter was not chosen by God to be the apostle to the Gentile world, but rather the Jews. Like I said, Paul was chosen as the apostle to the Gentile world because of his training, his upbringing outside of Jerusalem. He even explicitly states that Peter's mission field was to the Jewish nation. Now, Paul says this specifically. Let's look at Galatians 2:6. And from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. And on the contrary, he's talking about when he meets with Peter, James, and John, Acts chapter 5, I think. It's escaping me for some reason. But when he goes to meet them, he says they added nothing to me, which means that Paul wasn't preaching a different gospel, right? He was preaching the same gospel that they were. They didn't add anything to him. He wasn't preaching anything heretical or blasphemous. So he says nothing was added to me. So that's what that is referring to. On the contrary, when they say I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, the Jews, not the Gentiles. For he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised, the Jews, worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised, the Jews. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. So the Pope, supposedly the first Pope, is being opposed, chastised. He's being, critiqued by Paul to his face. The leader of the church, the leader of the Universal Catholic Church, is being told he's wrong by Paul to his face in front of an audience of people. Verse 12, for before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party, because obviously he was preaching, teaching, and was the apostle to the Jews, the circumcised party. So obviously he felt that he had a pull to them, a draw to them. So he obviously kind of would, it seems like he's spending time with them, and so he's, even though he's supposed to be, open and a brother to Gentile believers now as well, he sides with Jews and hypocritical men. Verse 13. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him. So obviously the other Jews see him as the apostle to the Jews, acting like this. So they start to mirror him. They start to act the way he's acting. They start to, shun the Gentile believers. So that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy, the one who was with Paul. But when I saw their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I went to Cephas before all of them. So he's openly rebuking the first pope in front of people. If you, though, a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? So here we go, Peter being corrected by Paul, which is very interesting, because if Paul is not the first pope, and if Peter is the pope, and if he is the one who is supposed to be leading the church, then why is he being called Satan by Jesus? Why is he being corrected by Paul? Why do we see him being called the apostle to the Jews multiple times, and Paul and Barnabas the apostle to the Gentiles? It doesn't seem like Roman Catholic tradition is lining up with the biblical narrative. Let's look at some other things. Stinking flies in here. So let's see. So Peter, right? In 1 Peter 2:12, we see Peter addressing the Jews in his own letter, right? So 1 Peter 2:12, to keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, because of their dispersion into the Gentiles' lands. So this is obviously Peter's writing to the people who have been dispersed. And if you read Peter chapter 1, you can see who they are, the people being dispersed. He makes no reference to his papal authority throughout his letters, though, which is interesting. Instead, he gives commands to be subject to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to the governors sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. 1 Peter 2:13 through 14. No reference to the Catholic Church, or to a cardinal of bishops, or to a local parish, or to anything like that. We see obviously in today's church. Later in 1 Peter chapter 5, we see Peter exhorting not the church, bishops and cardinals, as leaders among the church, but rather local elders. So 1 Peter 5, 1 through 5, I'll go ahead and read that. So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder, and a witness of the suffering of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. So he just calls himself a fellow elder, an elder among himself, talking to local elders in an area, telling them what they need to do. He says to the local elders, not to bishops, cardinals, not to himself, not to the authority of the church, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. I think we can see the papacy and popes not following that throughout history. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders, not the church, the cardinals, the bishops, the pope. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility towards one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So in closing, got a couple of remarks here. So with so little direct, explicit scriptural support, how has Rome been able to build such a vast and expansive system? Because it does seem weird that when there's so little biblical support for what we see in 2,000 years give or take, of supposed Catholic Church history, why is there so little similarity between the biblical text and narrative and what we see presently and even historically in the Roman Catholic Church? How have they been able to convince so many people that their version of the Bible is correct? Well, I think there's two main reasons. And the first reason is, I think, a universal reason that every single person who calls himself Christian, whatever that may be, I think this applies to everybody. Catholics, Roman Catholics, Protestants alike, Mormons, the cults. The main reason that things like this happen, this fly is getting in my video, is biblical ignorance. Biblical ignorance. If there's a widespread issue in the church, however broad you want to define it, I think it's biblical ignorance. People lack such a basic understanding of the Bible that they can be convinced of almost anything these days. Like I said, it's not just a Roman Catholic issue, but a world issue. There's just as many weird, wacky, and biblically illiterate movements in the Protestant world as there are in the Roman Catholic world and throughout history. Obviously, one of the most irritating, unsettling, frustrating movements in the Protestant world that stems from biblical ignorance is the charismatic movement. Oh man, Roman Catholics, if you see, I understand Roman Catholics talking about Protestant denominations and split-offs and issues, and I think there is some merit to when we get weird offshoots like the charismatic movement. These Todd Whites, Benny Hinn's, Kenneth Copeland's, Creflo Dollars, all the people on TBN, all the Jesse Duplantis, Hillsong and Bethel, Bill Johnson, all these nutty weird people. There is such an ignorance when it comes to the Bible and the biblical narrative that I think that's a universal problem. Now, I think that is obviously one reason that a lot of Roman Catholics get led astray, is because their biblical knowledge and understanding is sparse, if they have any. But I mean, that seems like a pretty universal issue. But what I see and hear from Roman Catholics who convert to Protestantism, especially to the Reformed camp in Protestantism, is they say, my biblical knowledge was so lacking, so empty. The Bible is not an essential thing for Roman Catholics. Tradition is, the Mass is, following the structure is, the Papacy is, Mary is, prayers to Mary, prayers to saints. But actual biblical knowledge and taking time to study what is in the Bible seems to be fairly inconsequential to the daily average Roman Catholic. And I think that says a lot. And the second reason is anachronisms in building mountains. Now, what do I mean by that? Rome is better at any other system when it comes to building mountains out of hills. Now, what I mean by this is that Rome takes a single verse, or a very small section of verses, and builds an entire dogmatic system off of it. I think the example of this video can be seen. We see Rome building a mountain, the Papacy, off of a small grouping of verses. Rome has been able to build a religious system with its own city in Italy that has a leader who speaks supposedly directly for God. But I think I've shown in this video that their case and their claims for that are pretty weak. And again, looking back at the building a mountain out of a hill, Matthew 16, there's about 2 to 3 verses in Matthew 16, supposedly where Peter's established as a rock. He's given the keys and the ability to bind and loose on earth, and it'll be bound or loosed in heaven. And those 3 verses right there have built an empire of billions of dollars, of Vatican cities and papal states, and cardinals and bishops, and the Roman, the Papacy and its infallibility and dogmas. And so much has been made and built from a small, tiny section of Scripture. Now, obviously, just because it's a small section of Scripture doesn't mean it's unimportant, but what they've done is they read so much back. And I made a video the other day talking about the anachronisms on my vlog channel. Maybe you could spend some time looking at that. But I think Rome does better than just about anybody at doing that. Especially, the further down they get, they say, well, this is how it is today, and this is how it's always been, and we're going to prove to you this is how it's always been, because we're going to take the ideas we have today and then we're going to read them back into the biblical text. So if you start with Rome and what they have today, and you let them kind of work their way back in by proof texting, using, you know, the verses and stuff that they want in the Bible, then it can sound convincing. But if you read the Bible and just let it speak for itself, and you let the Bible flesh out its ideas and what is important and what's not, papacy is so inconsequential that it's not even worth looking into, because the biblical evidence is so scant for it. It's just 3 verses. And then Peter himself, the Pope, doesn't mention it in his gospel, and he doesn't mention it in his letters. It's just, it's Rome is good at building entire mountains of little hills of doctrine or verses. Yeah, and so that's where I'm gonna stop here for now. I think it's been a pretty good introduction. I don't think Matthew 16 is very strong or authoritative in its establishment of the papacy. I think it's weak. I think it's lacking. I don't think there's a lot there, and I think what is there isn't actually proving what Roman Catholics wanted to prove. And if you want to prove me wrong, feel free. Leave it in the comments down below. You know, make a response video. Now, if you make a comment, like I had a gentleman the other day commenting on my video, and it was a Q&A video. He was obviously very upset, and he commented 4 or 5 different times, and his comments were pretty hostile, to say the least. Now, I understand that it is upsetting when you hear somebody challenging your worldview, and maybe upsetting to hear things you never heard before, and maybe upsetting to have your foundations rocked when you realize that there's not as much there as you thought there was, or there's nothing there. But I do try to be respectful in my videos. You know, I try to offer evidence, biblical evidence, historical evidence. And if you're going to be like this person in the comments, who I'm afraid I can't remember the name, but you can go back and look at that video, and you have a lot of hostile things, and you're putting words in my mouth, like saying that I said the satanic Roman Catholic Bible, which I never said the word satanic about their Catholic Bible. I was talking about the canon, and you say a bunch of other things, and then you just get an attitude about it, and, yeah, well, here's some truth for you. I'm not going to interact with you, most likely, because that's not what I'm here. I'm not here to fight with you. I'm not here to score points or to get jabs in. I'm here to talk about truth, because that's what we all need. That's what we're all striving for. And I want God's truth. Not my truth, not my emotions, not my, you know, my carnal nature's truth, whatever that is, how subjective that is. I want the truth. So please just, you know, be civil in the comments, and I'll try to be civil in my videos. And then, yeah, then I might interact with you, actually. But thanks for stopping by, guys. Appreciate you watching this video. Like this video if you found it helpful. Excuse me. And then subscribe to my channel if you want to see more stuff like this. I'm going to keep doing videos on Roman Catholicism, I think, for the time being. I might jump into some other stuff, but I want to keep going on this. You know, there's more I could say about the papacy. I'll probably, you know, aim that directed at what I see in the comments. There's Mary. There's all sorts of stuff we could talk about. So we'll get into that in a future video. But thanks for stopping by, guys. Appreciate it. See you.